underperform on the focal firm's voluntary disclosure dates. Again, the effect is to the tune of 20 to 30 basis points on average. And it's an effect that spans industry and sector boundaries. So it's not just the most closely related peers, but even peers in different economic sectors. We then refine this with our model-based analysis. We develop a parsimonious model of sabotage disclosure in the context of a rank order TSR tournament, and we derive some predictions with respect to which particular price peers should a manager be most inclined to try to sabotage. We take those predictions to the data, and we find, consistent with our predictions, it's those peers whose stock price underperformance would most benefit the disclosing firm's CEO that take the biggest stock price tumbles. And then lastly, we offer a couple mechanism tests to try to better understand what's going on. We look at stock liquidity and trading volumes to try to quantify the amount of information contained in these disclosures. We find that these disclosures become somewhat less informative than usual about the disclosing firm itself, somewhat more informative than usual about the peers being harmed. We then look for evidence of stock price reversals after these disclosure events. If we were to observe these, it would suggest that these are, disinformation campaigns resulting in some temporary mispricing. We don't observe any evidence of that, at least not in a broad scale. So it seems to be more consistent with legitimate information being brought to light in these disclosures. And then lastly, we look at the underlying textual content. And what we find is that firms will explicitly mention their peers by name with some regularity. Price peers get named, profit peers get named. Price peers get named more often. But what's particularly noteworthy is that when price peers get named, that's associated with underperformance. When profit peers get named, there's no systematic association with performing better or worse on that same date. Now, I do want to offer a couple caveats and cautions. The first one is we're not going to be able to give you a smoking gun in this study. We don't have a perfect lens into managerial intent. And while we have a number of anecdotes to offer that we think sort of fit nicely with the story we have in mind, I can't show you an example of a disclosure that I say, this would be impossible to explain this specific disclosure without our story. So we do have plenty of anecdotes, which we'll get to later. And what we offer empirically is a pretty broad swath of evidence showing that the benefits the manager would get from harming a particular peer is very closely associated with the harm that that peer experiences. But it's sort of through that lens that we have to infer the intent behind these disclosures. And secondly, I want to caution that what we're documenting here is likely a lower bound on the extent of this RPE-induced sabotage. We're looking at one specific tactic that a firm might use, going through their voluntary disclosure, but to the extent that they use other tactics, operational approaches related to their product market pricing, their production schedules, product mimicry, things of that sort, our analyses are not able to comment on the extent to which these approaches are going on as well. So with that, I think I'll open up the floor to questions and comments. Yeah, Eric.
Hey, Matt. Can you help me to think a little bit about the equilibrium that you have in mind going into this sort of strategic interaction, in the sense that you have this result that I issue a negative disclosure about my peers and sort of the price drops, but it sort of doesn't reverse. So it's not some sort of transitory effect. But so knowing that there are other firms that are out there sort of engaging in this game, why don't I, as a market participant, update ahead of time in anticipation of people engaging in this game?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So you're talking specifically about the capital market equilibrium. So I would say it is somewhat surprising, especially since a lot of these disclosure dates are, even if you don't necessarily know in advance it's going to be exactly this Tuesday, you have a rough idea in most cases, like, oh, it's coming up in the next week or so. You would expect capital market participants would be able to run similar analyses to what we've done, say, hey, these are the ones that are most likely. Like, if there's any dirt on these firms, it's going to come out on that date. Let's protect ourselves against that ex ante. And we don't observe evidence of that. So it could be that there's some market inefficiency here. Maybe it's just there's some uncertainty about when the disclosure will happen, and that's helping us find this effect. But it's possible that this is these are not 8 percentage point drops in most cases. It's 20 to 30 basis points. It's possible that this is just a little bit of inefficiency that could eventually get priced away, but wasn't at this point. Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, it's a little bit related. So I guess I struggle with the word sabotage. I don't know what the exact definition is, but you started with these anecdotes of maybe like kneecapping an athlete or spreading gossip about somebody. But in this case, it seems like this is almost just corrective disclosure. Like the announcing firm's shareholders are happy because they get a more precise signal. The peer firm's shareholders are probably also happy because they get some new information about the performance. And it's all going to be revealed soon anyway. So is this really sabotage?
So I would say yes, but I would caution that like the definition that I would use for sabotage is sort of coming from the RPE literature. It's a little bit less fun than kneecapping an athlete. That's of course a subset of what we mean by sabotage. But really what we mean in this context is just you are internalizing the effect of your action on the measured performance of the peer group, and you are changing your actions in order to make that measured performance worse. So even if the peer firm goes, oh, okay, we were going to tell them about that, in 4 months. I guess it came out now. That's fine. And even if the shareholders go, ooh, we learned more information. This is great. Like even if there's no one on the other end who's upset about it, we would still call that, it's still a peer harming disclosure, even if the peer doesn't really care. You're harming their measured TSR performance in a way that, absent the contractual incentive from your RPE incentives to do so, you wouldn't have been as inclined. Now, I think, disclosure, I think one of the things that makes this a nice place to try to look for these types of strategies is exactly this. It's a pretty non-invasive, not so drastic approach. You don't have to change your own operations. You're probably not dramatically, ticking off these peer firms that, maybe are strategic partners. Maybe it's a supplier of yours, and you don't really want to be, poking the bear too much. As opposed to some of these other approaches, product market underpricing, product mimicry, like the shareholders really don't like when you do that, the other peer is really not going to like when you do that. So, this is potentially a soft touch approach. Now, it doesn't have to be soft touch. It could be, you're leaking their trade secret. I don't have an anecdote of that. I doubt that would happen much, but that would certainly be consistent with our story as well. Yeah, Mark. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for the comment. I agree they're highly complementary. I would say they both have the same motivating question. I think the first 2 bullet points from my very first slide were very slightly tweaked from the ones from the conference presentation. But beyond just the motivating question, I think they really diverge pretty sharply, not just in terms of the precise empirical implementation, but the research questions are substantively different. Like the JAE paper it's really a contracting paper. All of the outcome variables, with the exception of one table, which provides very suggestive evidence, all of the outcome variables are board choices. Does the manager have RPE? Is it generic RPE? Is it a self-selected peer group? How similar are those peers? Are they in your same industry? Things of that sort. How much weight is on RPE? Here, what we're trying to understand is not, hey, what does the contract look like? We're taking the contracts as effectively exogenous and saying, how do managers act when they have these incentives? And there's one table in the JAE paper that sort of has that flavor, but it looks at very rough proxies, things like margins and markups over cost and things of that sort, which speaks somewhat to these approaches. But I think the claims that we're making in the paper are not that there's no evidence to suggest that this link exists. There is not yet evidence that directly looks at whether firms are taking actions to harm the measured performance of their peer group, which I would say is certainly absent from the JAE conference paper. There's nothing in there about the actions managers are taking, the harm that's hitting their peer groups, and that's sort of what we're trying to zoom in on in this paper. It's what are the actions that are being taken and how is it affecting peers' measured performance? Yeah, we can make that more clear. Yeah. All right, thank you. Christian.
So I have two comments. One comment is, I think you should spell out a little bit more clearly early on what you think the likely alternative or story is, what could explain these patterns, right? And so the one that I had in mind was, for instance, this idea that by making myself look really good, the ones that get harmed by that, and put harm in quotes here, is my closest peers, right? If I say I'm super good, I'm performing all that well and provide information about myself, I'm also providing, relatively speaking, probably some information that makes these other peers not look so good. And then it's in essence that information and the relative information that potentially could give a very similar pattern. In my mind, that would be sort of the alternative if you want to call it sabotage, right? Because the sabotage would have sort of like a deliberate action on top of that that would make the peers look not so good, as opposed to just making myself look good. And I think it'd be useful to talk a little bit about that. The second one is a little bit related to Mark's comment, and maybe this is because of the other paper that you're not going there, but it seems to me that if you think about the equilibrium, not the Kaplan-Meier one that Eric asked about, but there's also an equilibrium where the board is playing, right? Yeah. And so the question is, wouldn't the board to some extent understand some of that? And is this, couldn't they undo this? Or should they not think about the fact that the managers have the discretion and play this game? And it would also be useful to know how big is this effect even in compensation? So not just the stock return size of things, but what happens on the comp side?
Yeah, so let me address this sort of in reverse order quickly. So we would love to be able to say, like, this is the amount of excess compensation a manager gets from playing this game. It's not in the paper because we feel a little uncomfortable with how we're doing this, because, I mean, in order to do that, you have to be able to say, this is the counterfactual time series of returns that would have happened if the firm had used a different disclosure approach, which is, it's really difficult to say what that counterfactual would be. We've tried a number of approaches where we just delete disclosure days from the time series and see what happens, replace each peer's return with the average return of the peer group on that date, some various different ways to try to quantify it. What we keep coming back to is it's somewhere on the order of 5 to 15% of firms end up ranked at least one spot higher in their peer group than they otherwise would have. So it's not like firms that should be losing or ending up at the top of the tournament. I mean, maybe that happens in an instance here or there. But what we observe is it's sort of on average, you're rising a little bit in your peer group. On average, it's even less than one rank, but a substantial fraction, according to these very rough approaches, seem to end up somewhat more highly paid. Now, to the question of should the board be, are they aware of this? If they are aware of this, is this an unintended side effect that they're just willing to live with? Is this the desired behavior that they're trying to incentivize? I think it's a great question. It's not one that we take a stance on in this paper. I think, if it were these types of approaches, unless you're going sort of through a strategic delegation lens, you want to commit to aggressive behavior, I would sort of view most of these things as bad actions that the firm, they're doing something that's not value maximizing for their own shareholders. Boards should worry about that, try to protect against that ex ante. That's the idea behind the JAE paper. With the disclosure approach, it's not clear to me that this would be a first order concern to the board. Are they worried that a little bit of extra information about other peers is going to leak? Maybe that comes to the detriment slightly of the firm's own information environment because they're foregoing an opportunity to talk about their own performance, to talk about a peer's. Maybe they worry about it a little bit. It's not something that our results can really speak to, but my intuition is it wouldn't be a first order concern in the board's mind when they're contracting. Yeah, Valeri, and then I think Sugata.
follow up on Christian. So I had a similar concern, and just to kind of illustrate it with a simple example. Suppose, Apple announces earnings and basically shows that we sold a lot of iPhones. I mean, what kind of news is it for Samsung? Is it good news or is it bad? Probably not a very good news. So it could be a pretty much like rational updating of beliefs about the peer companies that you're picking up. I mean, how do you disentangle these stories?
So I think this is a good segue into the empirical design, because exactly these types of concerns are what we're trying to rule out. Okay. Let me come back to that in one slide, first get to Sugata, and then we'll get exactly to Christian and Valeri's, that first point, what is the other alternative explanation for these patterns ex ante? What are we doing empirically to try to rule that out? How much of that concern is still left over? Yeah, Sugata.
Matt. So this is related to what Christian and Valeri followed up on the same point. The reason you would care about whether the boards adjust for this is that might influence the choice of peers that go into RPE, the price peers that you talk about, and that's your treatment effect, right? Or the treatment firms. So unless you have some kind of equilibrium prediction where somehow firms are trapped into sabotaging because sabotaging is expected, we haven't seen your theory model, so maybe that's part of how you develop the theory for this. But it clearly comes across as you looking for causation, that if you have RPE, you're going to get this kind of behavior. But, so the interpretations are very different on the treatment effect. One is an equilibrium endogenous relation. The other is a causal relation, right? And if the peers are chosen based on an expectation of sabotage.
Yeah, so the story that we have in mind is very much a causal one. The manager's incentives are causing them to change their disclosure in this way that results in this, this harm to certain peers and not other peers. So let me, it's now come up 3 times. Let me sort of segue into the empirical design. And let me make just a couple sort of upfront comments here. The first is price versus profit. All right, this is just our very first sort of descriptive, let's take a quick look at this. We would kind of expect disclosure would have a first-order effect on price peers' TSR performance. It could have real effects that somehow affect your profit peers' profit performance. But the story you need for that, it's likely to be a much more subtle effect. Unless you're, creating operational changes in that peer, or you're, causing a boycott or things like that, your disclosure is unlikely to have a major effect on your peers' profits. But it could have a major effect on your peers' stock price. And so we think of this RTSR, right? You're a price peer, not a profit peer. So the incentive to harm you through disclosure should be much stronger there. Now, in terms of how we try to rule out some of these alternative explanations, so in large part what we're going to rely on, so let me just quickly walk through, again, this is just the baseline specification. We're looking at the peer's return, regressed on what type of peer you are. So all of these peers in our sample, they're your RPE peer that the firm has self-selected. But some of them are price-based grants. Some of them are profit-based grants. So if you're in a price-based grant, we would expect you to be treated potentially on these disclosure days. We're going to control for the firm's return as well, but we don't end up actually having to do that in the regression. And what we're trying to understand is, does this beta 1, right, which reflects the return differential based on what type of peer you are, does that load negatively on the disclosure days and then not really load at all on the non-disclosure days? Now, why do we think that profit peers are a reasonable control group? Not a perfect one. But they're self-selected bifocal firms due to exposure to common shocks in much the same way that price peers are. And when you look at sort of their characteristics, every single aspect of these price peers that we can measure is more or less, on average, identical to those same characteristics for the profit peers. They're the same size, they have the same stock return correlation, they have the same relative size to the focal firm, same stock price liquidity, same degree of industry overlap, same likelihood of being product market rivals according to their own voluntary disclosures, same likelihood of having a supply chain partnership. Now, where they differ is you're slightly more likely to have a mutual peer relationship with a price peer than a profit peer. But this can be entirely explained by the fact that price-based RPE is more popular than profit-based RPE. Now, the grant features across these two are quite different, but the underlying firms themselves are not. And in particular, in many situations, it's the same firm and the same peer, just at different points in time. You've got a peer that was a price peer from 2008 to 2010. Then that same firm has that same peer as a profit peer for a couple years, and then back to a price peer. And so we can observe that within firm-peer relationship. And then the last thing I'll say on that is, again, this is just our baseline. The next thing we're going to do is introduce the model to exploit variation among the price peers. So we're getting rid of the board's choice to make you a price peer and you a profit peer. And we're instead looking at, here's the set of peers that were chosen to be price peers. Your TSR performance to date over the course of the period affects how likely the manager should be to treat this peer versus that peer. And the model will sort of guide our predictions on that, which we will then test. And those are what we view as our main analyses. Yeah, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. So your response to Mark was basically you're going to try to abstract away from contracts a lot in this paper, but that leads me to wonder a little more about how much we can really attribute this behavior to the manager's strategy if we're not going to zoom in on their contracts and think about the process with the board that they're involved in. You know, there's other alternatives you could think about where maybe the investor relations group just always wants to say mean things about their peers. And these tend to be the kinds of scenarios where when the CEO has RPE, they're willing to let that slide when the investor relations group is scripting, you know, their kind of base rate of negative earnings calls, which would be consistent with some of the other papers we have on, you know, sabotaging behavior that's not necessarily through this RPE mechanism, but like Jinwan's paper or Vivian's paper that are doing, you know, similar types of things.
Yeah, I mean, so if the IR team specifically wants to harm the price peers used in the CEO pay plan, but not the profit peers used in the CEO pay plan, and they'll even follow the same peer through time and say, in the years that you're a price peer, we want to say mean things. In the year you're a profit peer, we don't. And also, as we get to the model, when you're neck and neck towards the end of the year, we want to say mean things. That would be indistinguishable from our results.
But
we wouldn't be able to say, but
aren't those peers like set by the board and there's like slow strategic discussion of who the price peers are and who the non-price peers are, so that would seem reasonable.
For price versus profit, potentially, again, like we don't observe any measurable difference between the price and the profit. I mean, I'm not saying it's a random assignment. I mean, that's our main concern with why this is just a table 3 and 4 result. But then when we get to the model, which we'll get to in a few minutes, what we're looking for is variation in how beneficial it would be to sabotage one specific price peer versus another that is based on the realization of the recent history of TSR performance. And with that, I mean, that's not perfectly exogenous either, but it's not the board's choice variable, it's not the CEO's choice variable, it's not the peer's choice variable, right? It's the realization of TSR performance. And that drives how beneficial it is to harm this one versus that one. And we observe that harm befalling those peers in a manner consistent with that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me get to Stephen and then talk about some tables.
So I had 2 questions, one related to that. I wanted to see a little more about why you pick a firm as a price peer and a profit peer. Like what drove that decision? Not just for like endogeneity and stuff,
Yeah.
but just descriptively. It was really interesting. I mean, you mentioned they're switching back and forth. It's the same as both. Like what drives all that?
To be honest, I would love to know the answer to that as well. Like when we first started this, you know, our first thought before we like even had the model for the variation among price peers,
Yeah.
we're like, well, the first thing we got to do, obviously, determinants test, like see which ones are going to be the price peers, like we couldn't do it. Like maybe if you do something incredibly sophisticated, but you know, we're just like throwing in sort of the who's who of the variables you'd think of. Oh, maybe the profit peers are more likely to be in your product market. And the price peers are, you know, supply chain. Nope,
Yeah,
that doesn't do
that.
it. Maybe the profit peers are a similar size to you, and the price peers, you know, could be more different. Nope. Like, we don't find anything that allows us to say ex ante, oh, this would make a good profit peer. This would make a good price peer. I talked to some compensation consultants about it, and I mean, their view, which is honestly not entirely consistent with what we observe here with the switching going on, but it was basically, there were a couple things. One is, well, compensation consultants like sort of have their view on which is a better performance measure, and so they'll say this versus that. We observe switches. We also observe within firm time heterogeneity. There'll be a firm, they'll have 20 peers, 8 of them will be profit peers, 15 of them will be price peers. Some of them overlap between the two groups because those add up to more than 20. So just the comp consultants have preferences wouldn't explain that. But that was sort of the first thing that I've been told. The
but
second
before-
was that
oh, yeah.
sometimes they're just trying to sort of diversify across metrics. So if they feel like you're sitting on more equity than we would normally want, like let's shift some of that focus to profit. Let's give you some profit RPE. If it's, we've got a lot of bonus tied to an EPS number, like, let's make you think a little bit more about stock price. So that could potentially explain some of the switches back and forth, if there's just time series variation in that. Vivian and then Ed,
Well,
and then I really
I
do
did
want
have
to.
one more thing. I wanted to also go back to the original question about why they're willing to design the contracts these way and
Yeah.
let this happen. And you mentioned like 15 to 20% raise one rank. What do you get for moving up a rank? Like what is
I think I said 5 to 15, but
Okay,
but
yeah.
it's comparable.
there?
So there's some heterogeneity in how much you can get from raising one rank. It can, in some cases, right, that can be $1 million right there from just
Okay.
ascending one rank, which, to you and me, obviously, is quite a lot. I would imagine, for even most CEOs, it's nothing to sneeze at, but like it's not like, making the difference between like jumping on and off
Yeah.
of the Fortune 500 or anything like
'Cause-
that. But, it can be a substantial monetary incentive just from a one rank increase. Especially if you're at the top of the peer group and it's like 3 versus 2, 2 versus 1.
Yeah.
That tends to be bigger than going from 14 to 13.
I guess the reason I ask is it could be the case that the board knows you're going to play this game. It's just worth it to filter out the noise. I know you're going to play the game. I lower your pay ex
Yeah.
ante in expectation of the extra benefit you're going to get. These peer disclosures don't really harm me, so I let you play the game. I pay you a little less. You eke a little more out. I'm happy. You're happy. It's just worth the cost to let the game happen.
That would be, like, I don't have a specification I can point to that defends that interpretation, but that is 100% my view on this. They're using RPE for some risk-sharing benefits. This is maybe a cost they're happy to eat, or it's maybe something they're just totally indifferent to. Like, oh, you're sort of fiddling with the dials of your voluntary disclosure practices in a way that doesn't seem that costly to us. That's, you do what you want to do, we'll give you a little extra compensation, I guess. And maybe they change the comp awards at those target points, anticipating this behavior ex ante. Vivian. Okay, yeah, we could talk about it more. My view on sort of the biggest distinctions, I think we do acknowledge, you're also providing some evidence on this. One of the big things, correct me if I'm wrong, but like your paper was more focused on what the firm is really signaling about themselves when they say mean things on Twitter. There wasn't a ton about, like, this is the firm that they're trying to make take a stock price tumble for this reason, or this is the firm that they're trying to harm the operations of by like causing a public outcry. So it was much more, a firm can make themselves look good by just, sort of getting a bunch of likes and, flagging, some information about another firm that's a little bit embarrassing for them, even if that information's already been potentially fully priced in, because it's, often it was tweeting a news report from 4 months ago it's just sort of like sticking a fork in somebody's wound. Like the capital market probably knows. But I agree, yeah, we can sort of pay better homage there if needed. Yeah, Ed.
Matt, I apologize. After this question, maybe
Yeah,
it's time
absolutely.
to take a break and move forward.
So this is a quick question. Maybe it's just institutional. So if the board is worried that the manager is going to take a costly action to disclose this extra information, could they just change the measurement window of the peers' performance and just say, we're going to measure the peers' performance after their annual disclosure is done? Because I think in your model, the information is going to come out at the 10K date or the earnings announcement date.
Are you talking about like ex ante? Could they try to get the windows
Yeah, they
to
said, well,
anticipate when the news will come out?
We're going to measure
Or-
the CEO's performance over, this window, and the peer, like, that ends with the disclosure of the performance of our firm. And the peers' performance, we're going to measure over the analogous window. Not the exact same dates, but we're going to wait until the peers' performance has been fully revealed to the market.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I think that could work if what the firm was going to leak was like, this is what their EPS number is going to be in 2 months. And in some cases, maybe that is sort of, what it is that they're providing to the market. But I think in a lot of situations, like the firm could have some information about, what the peers' profits are going to be like 2 years from now, 3 years from now. There's evidence that there was a recent ProPublica article about managers, making material insider trades, not about, not in their own firms, but, other firms that they're economically related to. They clearly have sort of long horizon private information, private in the sense that it's not known by the market. It's probably, in many cases known by the other peers. And the other thing is it could be information about things that they're planning to maybe do in the future that the peer might not even know about, like, a product market encroachment. If I'm sort of like right on the cusp of getting a bigger bonus, I can just announce that I'm thinking about doing that right now. Your stock price is going to take a tumble right now. We don't have to wait until I do it 2 or 3 years from now. All right, let me move on to some tables, and then I'll come back to all of you. So first, let me just sort of walk through again. The research design we're using in our baseline is a difference in differences estimator, where we're trying to see, do peer returns vary systematically with the type of peer that you are, in a manner that is differential based on whether the focal firm is issuing voluntary guidance on that date. And what we find is on the disclosure dates, that's all the odd-numbered specifications, we see that the RTSR, the price peers, systematically underperform relative to the profit peers. On the non-disclosure dates, there's absolutely nothing going on that is different between the price and profit peers, at least in terms of average return. And let me just sort of note the fixed effect structure here. Here it's somewhat loose. It's SIC plus peer. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have these firm-peer interactive fixed effects. So this is the same firm with the same peer at multiple points in time. Sometimes that peer is a profit peer. Sometimes that peer is a price peer. When they're a price peer, they underperform by 30 basis points on that day relative to when that same peer was a profit peer for that same firm. Now again, that doesn't mean it's causal. We have concerns about the endogeneity of even these switches in what type of peer you are. But it's not, oh, well, they're just a substantively different type of peer that gets used as one versus another. The other thing I want to flag, which is somewhat responsive to Christian and Valeri's point, this is not like your closest product market competitors get this spillover and nobody else does. What we find is that this disclosure spillover seems to exist in the systematic pattern within your same 4-digit SIC, outside of your same 4-digit SIC, no significant difference, still hovering around that 20 to 30 basis point magnitude. And then we can even do inside versus outside of your SIC1. So it's not Apple and Samsung exclusively driving this. It's, basically you could have RPE peers that are in dramatically different industries than you, which that in and of itself is kind of an interesting thing that firms would do this. But what we observe is the extent of these underperformance effects for the price peers doesn't seem to vary based on what type of peer they are. The other thing I want to flag, I don't have a mouse, so I can't actually click. We have a flipped specification, which is not in the paper, but I'm very excited about it. It was one of Jeremy Michael's suggestions, and we recently added it. Basically what we do is we take this exact specification, we flip the firms and the peers. And so we look at what happens to the focal firm's return on the peer's disclosure date. If this is just something about the relationship between the peer and the firm, right, that's probably going to be roughly symmetric, though the RPE incentives almost never are. 90% of the time, it's an asymmetric RPE relationship. I'm your peer, you're not my peer. So one of us cares about the other one's TSR performance in a way that the other does not. What we find, I don't know, could you click where it says flipped specification? Total zeros all the way across the board. When the peer discloses, there's no effect on the focal firm's performance, disclosure day, non-disclosure day. But when the focal firm discloses, we do observe this negative relation for the peer firms. All right, could you hit back? Thank you very much. All right, but now, let's get into the model, right? The reason that we're here for this specific conference. Can I just go through this slide and then I'll get to you? So the main problem, which has already been flagged quite a bit, peer assignment is endogenous, right? We can sort of get some comfort with the fixed effect structures, looking at the determinants and seeing that it's really hard to explain this peer profit versus price, but that's not a great fix. So what we want to do is try to exploit variation in the potential for sabotage among the peers that were chosen to be price peers. That gets me to my model. Now, Nemeth.
From the regression, I was trying to understand, and maybe this is obvious that I'm just missing it, what is the specific return pattern? Do you find that at the time of disclosure, the focal firm's stock return goes up and the peer firm's stock return goes down? Or does the focal firm's stock return go up, the peer firm's stock return goes up, but to a lesser degree? Or do both the focal firm and the peer firm's stock returns go down, but the peer firm's goes down to a different degree? And I ask this because I think depending on what the pattern is, it will help tease out some of the difference in mechanisms. And I don't know if this is clear from the regression or...
That is not clear from the regression. The regression only is allowing you to see that delta. Now, I can tell you both of those things are happening. On the disclosure dates, on average, right, forget about RPE. On average, right, we've got Dai-Jun Kwan models, we've got Verrecchia models. On average, disclosures tend to be good news. We do observe on average when you disclose, that's good news. We don't find that that's differential for whether you've got price peers in your RPE peer group or profit peers. Like, when you have good news about yourself, firms want to share that. Where we find the differential is there's no average underperformance for the profit peers on those disclosure dates. There is average underperformance for the price peers on those dates, just like without controlling for anything. That is not something that you could observe from the regression, though. You weren't missing it. It's just, that information is subsumed. But that's the pattern.
So that paints a different story, right? Like, I mean, some of the questions that came up about should the board do anything, if the stock return is positive for the disclosing firm, I mean, it's good news. And if the peer firm's stock return just is also positive, but to a lesser degree.
Which also happens plenty. And we would still consider, like, if it was supposed to naturally be 2% that day and the firm was able to make it 1.5, we would still call that like intentional peer harm, right? We wouldn't necessarily be able to say it's intentional from the regression, but in that hypothetical, I would call that a peer harming disclosure because you internalized the spillover and made their return lower than it otherwise would have been. Now, we do observe on average it's negative, but there are plenty of cases where both of them are positive. Or even the focal firm's return is negative, the peer's return is positive, but our regression suggests they're trying to make it less positive than it otherwise would have been. I mean, so I would say the reason we're focused sort of on the differences is because from an RPE standpoint, the levels don't matter. It is only those differences. But the descriptive pattern is average negative returns.
And all
for
what
those
I'm
price
saying
peers.
is from the alternative explanation standpoints, I think the levels can help.
Okay.
Understand.
Thank you.
Can I just do a small follow-up?
Yeah,
When
absolutely.
you talk about how you're going to prove this, you have less subtle and then more subtle and then the break your knee type thing. I mean,
We don't have the break your knee type thing.
The first point you said is like, good news is mine, bad news is ours, right? Like that. I mean, you can look for these differential levels. In good news day, you find like the firm moves up, everybody stays. On bad news day, you're going to get harmed, so everybody moves down, right? Like documenting that good news versus bad news differential effect on the levels might give you a sense.
Okay, yeah, we could do, so you're thinking like an interactive regression of
trying to
the
separate
firm's
the
return
20
and
basis
the,
points from good news day, bad news days, and then the firm versus the peer, which I think is what Nemet's getting.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. Yeah, Zach. We can hear you regardless, it's all right.
So, but I do think that at the same time, CEOs are hyper-competitive people, and if you put this thing in their contract, they're going to care about it, and they're going to throw shade at their competitors when they have a chance. So, sort of towards that end, and this is more of a statement than a question, but like the part of the paper that I found like most believable was sort of like table 12, where you're like, they talk about it more negatively. Like, I'm totally on board with that. And then, maybe where I become a little bit more skeptical is when, you get into these very sort of granular things about them slightly beating people on this specification.
Yeah, I mean, so it's something that we've talked about, the possibility of just sort of inverting some of the structure of the paper. Like start off with like, hey, here's some earnings calls, here's some things managers say, and then getting into like, what's the theory that might explain this? It's this RPE sabotage thing. Let's show you the baseline specification, then get into a model. It is something, yeah, I mean, we might consider changing it in this way in the future. Now, to your first point about, is this something that managers are in continuous time always thinking about? We don't need that, really. What we need is, the day before they're going to have a very public-facing disclosure event, like an earnings call, they're aware, like, oh, in 2 months, I'm going to get evaluated on the basis of which peers I've beaten. This one has had a great year. We've had a great year, too. We're pretty neck and neck on this year's TSR performance. I'm going to get $800,000 and bragging rights if I beat them. Like, to me, it's like whether it's the monetary RPE incentives or the hyper-competitive nature, want to beat you on whatever performance metric is in my contract, I can't distinguish between those two, and frankly, I don't know that it really matters. If what we care about is, hey, when you give a manager these incentives, how do they behave? Like the psychology or the rational, homo economicus behavior underlying that is not something we can speak to. I agree with you. I think a lot of these CEOs, the winning matters to them way more than the extra compensation, which I think is perfectly consistent with the story that we have.
Matt, let's see the model
Yeah.
maybe.
All right, so we've got a very simple model. We'll start with the most basic setup, which is a firm with a single price peer. What we have is basically at the beginning of each performance period, right, TSRs start out at 0, and they evolve according to a Brownian path. So that's like the natural, if nobody intervenes, there's just going to be some natural Brownian evolution of these prices. For simplicity, we assume that these are uncorrelated Brownian paths, which is, of course, not descriptive. Your RPE peers have very correlated price paths to you. This is just something that we do sort of for ease of exposition here, because what really matters is the differential between the price paths. You could allow for arbitrary correlation. Just think of these sigma squareds as talking about the idiosyncratic portion of these price paths. But so what we have is the firm and a peer following this Brownian price path. And then at some point in the period, the manager gets to observe what was TSR performance to date up until now. Okay, they're beating me by delta, I'm beating them by delta, right? There's some differential between us. We call it delta, which is defined to be the peer's performance minus yours. So a positive delta means you're losing, a negative delta means you're currently winning. And they have the option at that point to issue a disclosure that will harm the peer's TSR by H. And the main tensions in the model are, number one, dynamic reversals. What you're doing is you are accelerating the revelation of information that would otherwise come out in a subsequent period. So you're not changing, there's no real effect of this, you're not changing operations, it's just, there's a signal that would have gotten priced later, I want it priced right now. The second is we allow for a capital market cost to the disclosing firm. This can be set to 0, so you don't need it in there. But we basically allow for this to be a deviation from the price maximizing disclosure practice that the focal firm would otherwise follow. So there's some spillover of the harm onto the firm itself with a parameter gamma. Could be 0, could be anything up to 1. Of course, if you make it greater than 1, trivially, no manager would ever play this game. And then we also allow for a personal cost. This is sort of a catch-all for anything you want to include in there. We don't even require that it's necessarily a positive amount. You could imagine a negative personal cost for a manager who just loves talking smack about their RPE peers. But this is just, sort of you can level offset the cost or benefit to the manager from engaging in this. And so what really matters sort of theoretically are the win probabilities if you do sabotage versus if you don't sabotage in the current period and the subsequent period when the information would otherwise come out. Shu.
So one of the questions I'm kind of struggling with is, where does this private information come from? Because conceptually, I can think about, if I want to beat my competitor, I can just, exert a lot of effort to do my job, or I could just try to poke around and then, try to get some bad news and then hurt my competitor. So it appears to me that some of your anecdotal examples, they will have different implications for where the information comes from. For example, if you poach your employee from your competitor, that means you're actually doing a good job. and at the same time, you can use that information to harm your competitor. So in that case, you may not necessarily have a
Sabotage intent?
have a sabotage. I mean, in a sense, you're just doing a good job. But on the other hand, if you just, let's say, in Vivian's case, just dig into your competitor's social media and then try to see if you can get something out of it, it would interfere with your with your value maximizing strategy. So I think there's something, perhaps, I'm not sure how much you can do with your data, but you can actually maybe dig into these kind of a textual analysis and then see what kind of peer harming disclosure is associated with whether it's really related with you're doing your job or versus you're actually not doing your job but trying to sabotage. And then another kind of related issue is you would think that the pure sabotaging effect will be higher if you go towards the end of the fiscal year, because first you're just kind of doing your job, and then near the end of the year, then when you're running out of options, this is probably what you would do. So
Yeah, so let me start with the last bit. That sort of you're running out of options, it's like, we don't have that in the model, but that is very much sort of one of the things we're thinking about with, why disclosure, why not an operational approach? Even an operational approach that's just effort exertion. Well, I mean, if it's late November, there's only so much operationally you can do, but hey, if there's some news that's gonna come out in March and you get evaluated December 31, like disclosure would be a great way to have this influence your performance metric now. Now to the broader point that, hey, you might say something that hurts a peer, not caring about it, right? Absolutely. So we're not claiming like that disclosure spillovers exist implies that they are internalized. What we want to do empirically is say, when would the benefits of internalizing those negative spillovers be higher versus lower? And we can observe that the amount of those negative spillovers are greater when the contractual incentives to inflict them are greater. So to the extent that, a particular anecdote, hey, a firm said our products are better than their products according to this recent survey, right? Like that's something that a firm may want to say with or without RPE incentives. But the benefits of saying it with RPE incentives are greater than without because you now internalize those spillovers. So at the margin, there will be disclosures, at least this is what we have in mind. At the margin, there will be examples of these types of disclosures that get withheld or disclosed based on whether that RPE incentive is strong enough. Now, can we find a specific anecdote where we know this is one that would have been withheld if they didn't have these incentives? No, we're not able to do that sort of on a case-by-case, but the systematic evidence in the return patterns, and to a lesser extent in the text analysis with the peer naming, suggests that firms are substituting across this margin. Yeah. And after this, let me move on through the model of it.
Okay. So does it matter if you're mutual peers? I mean, if you're mutual peers, would you be concerned that how would your peers talk about you when it is their turn?
Oh, absolutely. So that's not something that we have in the model. We tried to make some progress with that. That turned out to be very hard to have sort of the backwards induction on like what I say about you might influence what you want to say about me. But I will walk through, I think this is our table 9 result on mutual peer relationships and this like possibility of retaliation. We would expect that when it's a mutual peer relationship, the managers are aware of that. They might change their disclosure strategies in advance, understanding like, hey, if I say something about you, like, not thinking about things like pettiness and, the desire for retribution, like, I'm just changing our relative stock performance, which is decision relevant to your disclosure strategy because we're RPE peers mutually. And so we see some sort of like forbearance in some cases. We'll get to that in a few slides. But first, so I'm not going to really walk through the math on this, but effectively what we have, I think this is the easier way to intuit it. We have some time series of delta that goes on from the start of the year starting at 0 up until some time t, which here we've got it like 3/4 of the way approximately through the year. And then at that point, we don't know how the rest of the path is going to go. We have a statistical understanding of how the path would naturally evolve that leads some uncertainty. So the way delta is defined, remember a negative value means you're winning, positive means you're losing. So right now, the probability of winning, if you just let the thing play out, is the proportion of this Gaussian that's lying below the 0 line. So right now they've got, maybe like a 1 out of 8 chance of winning or something like that. But if they can harm that peer by an amount of h, harm themselves by an amount of gamma h, they create this wedge between the two of 1 minus gamma h that now increases the fraction of the mass of the Gaussian that's below that 0 mark. So they've dramatically increased their probability of beating that peer. But here's what's important. The extent of that increase depends on the delta that we hit at time t. So here we can sort of think about, what we're really doing here with this sabotage. We've got these normal CDFs, because we want to know how much is below 0, and we're offsetting them horizontally by an amount of 1 minus gamma h. Now, both of these curves horizontally have the same displacement, but what we see is vertically, which is really what the manager cares about. It's what is the probability change in winning versus losing from harming you. Much smaller if you're way behind, much smaller if you're way ahead. But when you're somewhat neck and neck, this probability increase from harming you becomes dramatically larger. So from this, we get our first proposition, which basically allows us with some corollaries to derive all of our testable implications. The focal firm's manager will disclose the harmful information intuitively when the benefits exceed the cost. But what's really useful for us here is the benefit is a function of delta. The cost is entirely constant with respect to delta. So the benefit is, what is the change in probability of beating you right now? The cost is, how big is the bonus relative to my personal cost or benefit? And how much am I decreasing my odds of beating you in the future? Because I could have let this information come out later. And so here's sort of, rather than looking at the sliding diagrams, we can just sort of plot this thing out. It doesn't always look exactly like a normal distribution. For some parameter values, it comes a little bit, fatter at the nose. But it basically is a curve that looks like this, that has a maximum at 1 minus gamma h over 2, where again, gamma is the extent of the own spillover onto yourself from harm, and h is the amount you're able to harm your rival. So it's a symmetric shape centered around this positive value, 1 minus gamma h over 2, that can be closer to or farther from 0 depending on the value of h in particular. And just this shape of that curve gives us a number of clean testable predictions. So the first one we call the proximity effect. On average, it's more beneficial to harm a peer that is performing more similarly to you. If you're closer to neck and neck versus if you're further apart, the benefits are greater. We also have the aim up effect, which is, on average, it's better to harm a peer that's above you than one that's below you. This is true with or without controlling for the extent of proximity. And then third, an asymmetry effect. That proximity effect is greater when you're below, weaker when you're above. We can sort of see that from the curve. Below, we have strict increase, right? As you get closer and closer, the benefit increases. Above, here, it's going with the proximity effect, but over this interval, which is actually in many cases where a lot of the mass is, it's going in the opposite direction, so that's muting the muting the proximity effect, potentially, depending on the parameters, even reversing it. So what we do now is we take these predictions to the data, first looking at proximity and peer above, then we'll look at the asymmetry, and then, I know I'm a little crunched for time here, we'll extend this to multiple peers that will also give us what we call a density effect prediction, which is when there are more other peers right nearby you, you're less inclined to sabotage, because any sabotage to one decreases your performance relative to all of the rest. But we're using a quasi-diff and diff design here. Now we have an indicator variable for if they're above you or below you, and a continuous variable for how close you are to that peer at the time of the disclosure, right before you've made the disclosure. And then again, we're testing for differences across disclosure versus non-disclosure dates. First, looking at proximity on its own, we find that on the non-disclosure dates, there's no effect of proximity and the peer's returns on that date. On the disclosure dates, though, we observe that greater degrees of proximity are associated with worse performance for the peer, and again, holds up with a variety of fixed effects. In the tightest specification here with the firm peer fixed effects, this means you have a firm with a peer. They've been a price peer throughout, right? We're not using the endogenous switching. But at some points in time, you're disclosing when you're far apart. At other points in time, you're disclosing when you're pretty neck and neck. And it's when that same peer is more neck and neck with you that we observe the underperformance on that date. Yeah, Andrew.
So you mentioned earnings calls a few times. I suspect that a big chunk of these are earnings announcement dates.
A good chunk of them are. So what we
So-
use is earnings guidance dates. It's often all bundled together.
Right, but so what do you gain by that choice? So this isn't a choice on a given day, does the
Yeah.
manager disclose or not? They're disclosing their earnings. It's a question of what they choose to say in that earnings announcement and conference call.
Absolutely.
So what do you gain by using these voluntary guidance dates rather than just using earnings announcement dates?
So what we,
Because you don't take advantage of any of the characteristics of the forecasts.
so we're not interested in the forecasts themselves at all. What we're interested is basically, what are the dates when a manager has chosen to pick up a megaphone and announce a lot of stuff to the market? And
But
you
those
know,
are earnings announcement dates. So
yeah, so I mean, many of these are earnings announcements dates. We could use those instead. We could maybe use those in addition and add, you know, like there are many proxies one could think about using for a date that a firm has, you know, a manager is picking up a megaphone to announce to the world. We might get a very similar pattern on the earnings announcement dates as well. We haven't looked into it. Now, these earnings guidance dates, like a lot of them correspond to earnings calls. And so, you know, this is a great opportunity for a manager to insert a lot of contextual information that could be useful for harming a peer. And that's what we have in mind. It's not the EPS forecast itself, like, you know, is it a little bit higher or lower than people expected? Like, that's not what we think is driving this. It's just a proxy for this is a day when the firm is choosing to provide a lot of information to the market, which is, you know, with a lot of attention, a great opportunity to influence other firms' prices. Yeah, one more, and then I want to
What
continue
is
on.
gamma gain in your model?
Gamma is how much your harm to the other spills over to yourself.
Yeah, did you try proxying for gamma? And because ideally you would like to say something good for you that it's bad for others, and
Yeah.
that would be like almost a positive, a negative gamma actually.
I mean, that would be, if we could proxy for gamma, if we could proxy for H, that would be great.
Because I mean,
I'd be happy to chat
the
after
key
with
mineral,
ways.
That's what we're trying to look at, right? Like you say good things that harm others and are good for you, versus when you say good things and everybody moves in the same
Yeah,
direction.
if we could proxy for those, we would be able to get a lot more testable implications out of the model. Those are very hard to proxy for. We haven't come up with a great way, but yeah, we would definitely love to. Let me scoot along here because I'm running out of time fairly quickly. We can do the same result for peer above. Again, on the disclosure days, you see that they perform significantly worse. On the non-disclosure days, we also observe this, and it's statistically significant. This could be some sort of a cost of capital effect. But importantly, the difference between the disclosure and non-disclosure dates is statistically significant. And it's much stronger on the disclosure dates versus the non-disclosure dates. Again, even with the firm peer fixed effects, the same peer at one point in time is ahead, at other points in time is below, and that is correlated with their performance. These variables are actually almost perfectly uncorrelated with each other as well. We can throw them in jointly. We observe basically no effect of one on the other in terms of the coefficients we recover. We see the proximity and peer above results coming through jointly. And the proximity effect gets stronger over the course of the year. As you get closer to the end of the year, you have a better sense who's going to be that marginal peer we want to get. We see that that gets stronger over the course of the year. The peer above gets somewhat stronger over the course of the year, but it is, you know, certainly from a statistical standpoint, much less striking of an effect. It is still significant in the differences across the bottom, but, you know, I wouldn't say anything to write home about. And again, we sort of see this coming through jointly. The peer above result a bit weaker, the proximity result still, you know, coming through. And then the asymmetry effect. This was that last prediction from that baseline model. The proximity result is dramatically stronger among those peers that are below the firm and goes away entirely, arguably flips sign, though it's not statistically significant, among those peers that are above, which is perfectly consistent with the results of the model. Now, we have an extended model with n peers, which gives us this one extra density prediction. I'm not going to spend much time on it because I want to get to some of the textual analysis at the very end. But it gives us this one extra prediction, this density effect prediction. When you're packed with a bunch of peers nearby, and it's costly to sabotage one because you lose ground to all the others, we observe that there's sort of a muting of this effect overall. We observe that when you're more clustered around, those peers don't perform as badly on those days. Retaliation, I'm sorry that I'm going to have to scoot past this, but we do expect retaliation might happen. We expect it would be more likely when the peer relationships are mutual, and in particular, we would expect a muting of the aim up effect. Why is this? Well, because if it's a mutual peer relationship and you're right above me and I sabotage you to make myself right above you, well, now I'm right above you, and you care about that, and you're going to try to hit me back. So that's why we would expect that to be muted. And we do, in fact, find that, though it's not a statistically significant difference across the mutual versus asymmetric peer relationships. I think in large part that's because 10% of these relationships are mutual, so it's just very hard to get sort of good evidence there. Let me skip through a couple of these sort of mechanismal tests and get to the one that Zach Kaplan believes, which is the text analysis. Right? What are firms actually disclosing to harm their peers? We would love to be able to definitively answer this. That's a little bit beyond what we're able to do. But one thing we are able to do, number one, see some anecdotes. So here, more closely related perhaps to what Vivian's paper shows, Wendy's likes to be snarky on Twitter. Now, it turns out that's not just somebody on their social media. The CEO also likes to be a little snarky in the earnings calls, reminding people about national taste tests where their fries were preferred to McDonald's. We also see sort of subtle notions of product market encroachment announcements. Here, Hershey's doesn't even mention Dean by name, but Dean is one of their price peers that they needed to outperform. Hershey's mentions we're planning to expand into dairy specifically, which is Dean's primary market. They were the biggest dairy distributor at the time. They had a 4% stock price decline on that date. We see, Goodrich saying, hey, if we miss earnings this year, blame Boeing. They're having some production difficulties. Boeing underperforms the rest of the peer group by 4% that day. And then finally, let me just wrap up with table 12, which is here what we're looking at is when a peer is mentioned, do they tend to underperform? And what we find is yes for RTSR peers, no for the profit peers, no effect for the profit peers on average. And when we split, we find that this is particularly true at the end of the year versus at the beginning, though it's not a significant difference across the two. And we find some results as well, though not always significant splits between the two based on readability, when it's easier to read, when there's more mention of competition, when it's more negative in tone. We see a stronger relation between the peer mentions and the peers' underperformance. All right, I'm out of time now. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate all the feedback. Thank you so much, and enjoy the remainder of the conference.
So thanks everyone very much for coming back from the break. So just very quickly, I'll introduce Frank. He's going to present the co-authored work on fraud power laws. Please remember to give him 10 minutes uninterrupted, and then he'll have 70 minutes in total to present. Frank, the floor is yours.
All right, so can you guys hear me? All right, so thank you, Phil, for the introduction. So on behalf of my co-author, Edward Chanel from WashU and Dr. Sins Russo from the New Economic School, I would like to thank the editors for including the paper into the conference, thank our reviewer for really great feedback and suggestions that help improve the paper. We look forward to everyone's feedback and suggestions, which we will incorporate into the next iteration of the draft. So the broad agenda of the paper is trying to understand the frequency and magnitudes of large frauds, where we define fraud as intentional manipulation that benefits a manager. So we know that over the past 2 decades, significant regulatory efforts have been devoted to monitoring financial reporting quality and reducing accounting frauds. However, we know from anecdotal evidence and the data that large misstatement frauds still happen. And if we look at the data, the average misstatement amount is around 2% of assets, excluding the largest 5% of misstatement cases where assets are measured at the beginning of the misstatement period. If we include these largest 5% of the cases, then the average jump to around 8% of total assets. If we think about the average restating period, which lasts for 2 to 3 years, so these numbers seem to be really influential, especially for the large cases. And these large cases are also important to understand by themselves because they impose the largest cost on the economy and they can potentially trigger significant regulatory changes. So to get us a better notion about the frequency and the distribution of fraud cases and misstatement cases, we first plot the distribution on the left panel, and we find this really interesting result that misstatement amounts follow a power law distribution. And what's really unique about this distribution is its heavy tail, which means that the frequency and magnitudes of large events happen at an order of magnitude than that's implied by a typical distribution, such as a normal distribution that characterizes many economic events. So to give you an example, the largest 5% of misstatements in the data collectively account for around 72% of the total misstatement amounts in dollar terms. For To be more precise, if we rank misstatement from top to bottom, and we take the top 5% of the largest misstatements, they collectively account for 72% of the total misstatement amounts. In comparison, to put this number into perspective, in comparison with the normal distribution with the same mean and the standard deviation as the misstatement data, this normal distribution, if we simulate the distribution, then the largest 5% of misstatement should only account for around 8% of the total misstatement amounts. So this suggests that the distribution of misstatement has a fat tail that is significantly larger than a typical distribution. And so then the question arises, what gives rise to this distribution? And more precisely speaking, a heavy tail, when I say heavy tail, it means that the tail is not exponentially bounded, and this is the case for a power law distribution because its density decays according to a polynomial, which is slower than the exponential function. And this intuition, this result is depicted on the right panel. So basically, if we compare the power law distribution with the exponential distribution, we can see that it decays according to a slower rate. Again, all of this is pointing to that we expect frequency and magnitude of misstatement, large misstatement, happen at an order of magnitude larger frequency than was implied by a normal distribution or an exponential distribution. So given this empirical finding, then we're going to present a dynamic model of a manager who's uncertain about the effectiveness of monitoring in terms of fraud detection, and the manager manipulates earnings. The main mechanism of the model is as follows. So the manager learns about the effectiveness of monitoring by committing fraud. As frauds go undetected, then the manager raises up the probability, the perception that the monitor is ineffective. As a result of these changes in perception, fraud size increases. And we show in the paper that this acceleration in fraud size leads to a power law distribution. We also conduct comparative stats with respect to detection intensity, which is the probability of detection. We show that improving detection intensity does not necessarily suppress power law. In fact, it may induce more extreme frauds. On the empirical side, in addition to finding a power law distribution, we also find that for a given restatement event, the amount of manipulation per period, which is we can think of as bias in earnings, increases over time, consistent with prior evidence of a slippery slope to misreporting. We also find the growth in the bias in earnings also increases over time, which is consistent with the prediction of a power law distribution. We also find suggestive evidence that a manager adjusts misstatement behavior based on misstatement detection by their audit firms, which is consistent with learning. So overall, the paper contributes to the literature on earnings manipulation. On the empirical side, our prediction of a power law distribution or heavy tail distribution can explain the occurrence of a slippery slope to misreporting. And our mechanism complements existing mechanisms that explain this phenomenon. And one thing I want to clarify up front is that a slippery slope does not necessarily lead to a power law distribution. This is because large frauds need not occur frequently enough if the increase in fraud size is slow or most frauds are already uncovered before they become large. And we also contribute to the theory literature on earnings manipulation. Existing theory differs from our theory in that those theories don't really predict the power law distribution. And one of the reasons is that the probability of detection and also the marginal penalty conditional on detection increase with fraud size. We put a natural constraint on the size of manipulation. And we can keep these assumptions. We can still show that in our case, because of the learning effect, we can still get a power law distribution. So with the next couple of minutes, I'm going to briefly set up the main model, the baseline model, and then I'll open up the floor for questions. So the baseline model is a discrete time model, but we will convert it to continuous time in a few slides, and I'll explain the reason why we do so. In each period, the firm generates earnings that's equal to an unmanipulated amount called X and the amount of manipulation. So you can think of delta M as the amount of earnings being manipulated for each period, and M is the cumulative amount of manipulation, which under clean surplus accounting is basically the bias in book value. Manipulation in our model is not observable to others, which gives rise to the role of detection. And there are two types of monitors denoted by alpha, which can take the value of 0 and 1, with probability alpha 0, which is the initial perception of the monitor's effectiveness by the manager. The monitor is effective and detects manipulation with probability Q. Well, with 1 minus alpha 0, the monitor never detects. When detected, the manager is fired and receives a terminal loss that takes a quadratic form of the amount of manipulation, which represents the net reputational losses and legal liabilities. So with this, if you have any questions about the motivation, some of the results, or the baseline model, feel free to interject. Yes, Lorianne.
So super interesting model. I think it's really nice to have this given all the research in this area. One thing that I always ask about with this type of research that I've thought a lot about is, again, the observability of fraud and misstatements, because it's a joint function of the actual violation and the detection by the regulator or by the auditor and stuff. And in particular, there's a lot of evidence that regulators will put a lot more emphasis on going after like large dollar frauds. So in your model, you talk about how everything works if you increase the probability of detection as the magnitude of the fraud increases. I was just wondering, not that you need to control for that, but could that fact in and of itself explain the power law distribution? Like, even if the actual violations are exponentially distributed or normally distributed, because the detection maybe is exponentially increasing, could that create the power law distribution and observed violations itself?
So you're saying that if we don't really have the mechanism in the model, the learning mechanism,
right?
So the answer is that would not, at least in the model, it would not, the power law would not arise. And the intuition for that is that if you exert more efforts in terms of detecting large frauds, that's going to make it more costly to commit larger frauds, right? So for the manager, and so that would, you can still get the acceleration of fraud size, but then it wouldn't be so frequent as what we observe in the data. So I think the frequency is what differentiates, the story that you have in mind and what we are documenting.
Yeah.
And one other thing I want to clarify is that we're only presenting one mechanism that explains the power law. So there could be other mechanisms that we are not aware of. But I think just the increase in the detection probability as the fraud size increases in itself is not sufficient to generate a power law distribution.
Well, depending on how quickly it's increasing, right? If it's linear, but if it is, maybe if it's exponential, it could lead to it. It would just be kind of interesting if you just pulled out that piece alone, because I know you added it on to everything else, but it would just be nice to know if you just have this, how much could that contribute to the power law, so that we could sort of understand empirically what the actual data is.
So we can definitely have more discussion. So this is definitely something we've tried, and then we can show that actually it would now give rise to a power law.
Great.
So, but that's a completely valid point. Yeah. So, Kevin?
Yeah, first of all, super interesting paper. One question I had in reading it was when you're talking about, is the monitor effective or not? You're probably thinking about specific to this firm. There's something about, is the SEC good at detecting the type of manipulation this firm is doing? And first of all, is that correct? Because you could also think, is the SEC effective in general at detecting frauds? And if you took that approach, I think it would generate very large frauds systematically across the economy, potentially at different periods of time, which seems less realistic than specifically something about this firm's environment and how it's interacting with the SEC's detection effectiveness.
Yeah, so we're definitely thinking about from the firms and the manager's perspective. And what we have in mind is an economy where there's cross-sectional differences in monitors' effectiveness. You just don't know which monitor you're dealing with. So that's kind of economy we have in mind. Is that?
Yeah.
All right. Stephen?
I think my question actually kind of relates to those two. What does the model imply about the frequency and size of undetected frauds?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So we will have a few slides, in a couple of slides, and I will explain this. Maybe I should jump forward in case there's, Chandra. So I'll go back to you and then Chandra's question.
Given that small frauds lead to big frauds, knowing that, why would the penalty take the form B times M squared? You want to penalize a small fraud enormously so that people don't find it worthwhile to engage in the learning process. Right? The model says that you commit small frauds because then you find out the effectiveness of detection. And if it's not detected, then you commit bigger frauds. Okay, so you want to shut that down, right? That's not a good thing. You want to prevent that from happening. So why would you have this kind of penalty, B times M squared?
So are you asking why is the cost function
Yeah,
quadratic?
and this is exogenous. You're simply putting an exogenous penalty. Why
Okay.
does it make sense? Why does it make sense? I would put a huge penalty on even on small frauds.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, people will not try to find out the detection probability by committing small frauds.
Okay, so you're saying from the so let me make sure I understand your question. So you're saying from the regulator's
Yeah, from
perspective, why don't I just impose huge penalty on really small frauds, and that would deter everything from.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
so I think if you take, so we do have an analysis that try to illustrate that even you have like an exponentially increased, penalty function, right? So even in that case, then, you would still get acceleration, so maybe I should defer that question to the main model where we do discuss, sort of when you would be able to, suppress fraud, power law distribution from arising. And I think your intuition is exactly correct in the sense that, if we have sort of a materiality threshold, then we can basically make the penalty at the threshold very high, and that would basically prevent learning from happening. So the key thing is that as long as the learning is happening, so at some point, the manager would be able to increase the fraud size because the marginal cost of committing fraud become increasingly smaller over time. So that needs to be shut down. So just the penalty itself is not sufficient. So we also need some materiality threshold. Then if you manipulate above, you can learn. And if you manipulate below, you can't really learn. And then in that case, because you never know whether your monitor is effective or not, then you would not increase the fraud size. So that's what we show. I think it's one of our main results.
So if
And
you
I think
look-
it's consistent with what you're saying.
No, what you're saying is that a small fraud would lead to a $10 billion penalty, and that would not matter. You're saying they will still commit small frauds. And I find that very hard to believe. It's not the exponential, it's not the growth. Okay, I'm saying that you could have a flat penalty. It doesn't grow with the size. It's a flat penalty, but it's a huge amount.
Oh, yeah.
It's a huge amount.
If you get a
In which
flat
case-
penalty, then the power law will still arise at some point because maybe I should jump to the so this will be a good slide to explain this point. So the manager here is risk neutral. It's going to maximize the utility from committing frauds. There are two types of two scenarios. The first one is when the frauds are detected. So the manager receives the amount of manipulation minus the penalty. And then when the fraud is not detected, then the manager just receives the amount of manipulation. And these two scenarios are weighted by the probability of reaching that stage. So basically the probability that fraud is detected in period T versus the fraud is not detected in period T. And then taking the first order condition with respect to manipulated amount gives rise to the equilibrium manipulation. So here, the fixed cost does not really play a role because it doesn't really affect the marginal behavior. So eventually, as time goes by, the perceived monitoring quality, monitoring effectiveness, conditional on no detection up to T-1 would decrease, and the fraud size would increase, okay, irrespective of the fixed cost. And the intuition for this result is that as time progresses without a detection, the manager gains confidence that the monitor is ineffective. And therefore, the perceived monitoring effectiveness decreases, and the manager responds by increasing the fraud size, and therefore the fraud size increases, which leads to a slippery slope. So the anticipation of this benefit from learning really motivates the manager to commit frauds to begin with. Yes.
Frank, just quickly, I'm trying to understand this. I was presuming, and I think I'm wrong on this, but I was presuming that alpha 0 and Q are a function of fraud size, but that's not true in your model, right? So how if you could easily think of situations where monitors are effective at detecting bigger frauds
Yeah.
than smaller ones, or
Yeah.
conditional on being effective, the detection rate is higher.
Yeah.
So that's not part of your model, is it?
So
Like it's making them a function of the fraud size?
yeah, making them a function of fraud size. So I think, going back to Nastia's comment yesterday, I think that's not the case empirically. But I think to your point, theoretically, it's still possible that the probability of detection increases with fraud size because there might be some patterns that you see in the data that suggest the firm is doing something that's unusual. So we do have an extension. I believe that's the first extension where we show that we can make the fraud size probability of detection as a function of fraud size, and we get this really interesting result that actually learning becomes faster. You're more likely to get a power law distribution. And the reason for that is that imagine a case in which you commit a large fraud and then you're not detected. Then you learn very quickly that the monitor must be ineffective, because if the monitor were effective, then the fraud would have been detected. So that in turn allows you to increase the fraud size. So you can have this countervailing effect going on in the model.
Okay.
All right. I think Rafi and then Mark and then Joe.
I'm going to try Chandra's question one more time. I think this is his question. With the more descriptively realistic cost function, M should be 0. Is what he's saying. Is that right, Chandra? Right. And the cost is huge, which makes M 0.
But isn't there a constitutional constraint? I mean, you can't just willy-nilly impose huge penalties for a small fraud theoretically, I understand the argument, but it seems to me legally, this seems highly problematic, no?
Yeah. So I agree with that. So institutionally, it would be really difficult to impose really large fixed costs when you just manipulate by delta. So I think that's really difficult. And we show in our model that even if you impose a large fixed cost, it's not going to change anything in our model. Yeah. Okay, so let's. So this is the equilibrium amount of manipulation. So we're basically saying that if so let me try this one more time. So in our case, the marginal benefit is a constant, right? So you can actually get an infinite amount of benefit. So therefore, the whatever large fixed cost that you impose is not going to affect the result. But I think institutionally, what's more realistic to say is that with a large fixed cost, yeah. So especially if you combine with the concave cost function, then in some cases you just don't commit fraud, period. And then in some cases you commit sort of the maximum amount of fraud. So that's going to be what happened in the model. Yeah, Phil. Sorry. Earlier was Billy Mark. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 So when you're saying loaded balance sheet, do you have in mind in some sort of if the balance sheet look unusual, then it's more likely to be targeted by the monitor, or do you have in mind a sort of a balance sheet constraints that prevent me from manipulating? Okay. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that kind of goes back to Sugata's earlier question about whether we can make the probability of detection as a function of the size of the fraud, which can be related to the below the balance sheet idea that you just have. So in that case, we get a more pronounced power law distribution because you learn faster that a monitor is ineffective. And the intuition, again, is that basically if you commit large size fraud and you basically blow up the balance sheet, and then the monitor still wasn't able to prove the existence of fraud, then you learn more quickly that your monitor is ineffective. As a result of that, undetected fraud can increase. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Yeah. So in our model, I want to make this clear. So in our model, the Q is going to be a function of the cumulative amount of fraud, so which is exactly what you are saying. So it's not going to be a function of the fraud that occurred in that particular period. We can make the model either way, but then I think the learning will still be going on. Yeah. Right. So yes, completely agree with that. Completely agree with that. So we're just saying that with that assumption in mind, what's going to happen within our model is going to lead to an even more pronounced power law distribution. And Joe, and then Phil, and then Sugata.
Long ago, I actually worked in internal audit, and you detect a lot of frauds that would never get in the financial statements.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're looking at this function and saying, oh, it looks like this, it's missing all of the frauds that were detected that aren't reported. And they're usually not reported because they're very small frauds.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess the question is, you're trying to explain this distribution, but you're missing a whole part of the distribution that's been detected that isn't being reported because it's not rising to the level of a misstatement in the financial statements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what does that mean for the model? Because, or not the model, the motivation of the paper, because I don't think that that's actually being reflected in the distribution that you're trying to explain.
So that's a fair point. So empirically, you're absolutely right. We really don't capture the undetected, detected but unreported frauds. In our model, we also have, in the main model, we have a materiality threshold that tries to get at your idea. So basically, the frauds are only detected and reported above the threshold. Below the threshold, the monitor does not really do anything. So that's sort of get at the idea you have in mind,
What
right?
do you mean the monitor doesn't do anything? When we detect fraud, they get fired.
Sorry?
I mean, when a low-level employee committed fraud, it might not be in the financial statements, but they would get fired for committing fraud.
So, okay, so here, from the monitor's perspective, their job is to detect fraud. If we impose a materiality threshold, their function is just to detect the fraud above the threshold, right? And you're saying basically that, they detect fraud below the threshold and then they don't report it? Is that sort of what you are suggesting?
They detect fraud, but it doesn't get in the financial statements, so you don't see it. So like I
Okay.
worked for an insurance company. An insurance agent decides to steal from their customers. That's not going to be a disclosure in the financial statements, but the internal audit function, as part of their process, catches these people committing fraud, and they report it to management, and the people get fired, and they get prosecuted, and they go to jail. But you don't see any of those disclosures because they're not material enough to make it to the financial statements. And so there's a huge amount of detection of fraud that's going on by, only 4% of frauds are caught by external auditors. Most of the frauds are being caught through the internal control systems, through the internal auditors, through the press, through other employees. And so there's a tremendous amount of other controls or other mechanisms and other detections of people acting inappropriately that just doesn't make it to the level of financial statement presentation. But if you're an agent at that company, fraud detection is going on. It's just you're not observing it as a researcher.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair point. So we can't really do anything about that. But I think in our model, our monitor isn't just about audit firms, so it can be more broader than the audit firms. So for example, it could be some internal control function that's actually play a role in terms of fraud detection. But our model does predict sort of in terms of the fraud that is reported, that detected and reported, is going to follow a power law distribution. But regarding whether that would deter, that would create incentive to commit fraud, then we can't really observe that in the data, therefore I can't really say anything about it in the data. So we are subject to basically the same limitation as other prior studies in terms of empirical, the empirical side. Yeah, Phil.
I'm going to go back to what I think Chandra and Christian were talking about. So I appreciate the point that I think Christian was saying, there might be legal restrictions on even if you believe the world worked a certain way and you wanted to impose a certain penalty function, you might not be able to. What would help me a bit, I just want to understand, like, given what we currently see in the regulatory domain, what is the justification for why we think of the cost of detection to the manager as increasing at an increasing rate? Is it like something about legal consequences or reputational consequences, or like just basically what's the institutional underpinning, I guess, for that assumption, basically?
So I think the idea, yeah, so that's a really good question. So the idea we have in mind is that if you commit larger fraud, the consequence for you might be larger. Maybe there's career concerns, there's reputational loss, there's also legal liability, compared to committing a small amount of frauds. For example, then the consequences might not be as severe as you commit a large fraud, which may also involve like jail time, for example. So that's really what we have in mind.
And so this isn't just like what might be, like you have some facts that you could state that would support that that's what actually is the case?
Yeah, so there's like prior studies looking at sort of the consequences of committing financial fraud. For example, 90% of them like lose their job, and then that seems to be like pretty significant loss for them. So we can think about whether that loss is big or small, but I don't think the convexity is something that has been like pretty well accepted by prior literature.
Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, Christian, and then Hannah.
So the question I have is, I find the story very intuitive in the sense that this is kind of exactly how I think parenting works and what your kids try to do, right? They kind of test you and, and then, and the more lenient you are, the more they're gonna, sort of feel emboldened and continue. So I get that, but when you take this to the data, what I'm a little bit worried about is differentiating two types of stories. One reason why I think there is bigger and bigger and bigger frauds has to do with, and you actually model that, because of the reversal of the accruals, right? Sort of because they reverse, you got to have a bigger one the next time to have an impact if the business hasn't improved. You want to continue to tell the story that you're growing and you're doing stuff.
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate that? Because I think for your story, it is this monitoring story and the learning about the monitor and the leniency of the monitor. And it's not because of the accruals reverse and gets bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And how empirically you then separate those two stories is sort of what I'm wondering about and not sure.
Yeah, that's a completely fair point. So like the accrual reversal can explain the increasing fraud patterns, but I think it does not necessarily lead to a increase in the amount of bias over time, in the sense that the slope of the increase doesn't have to be that convex. So it really depends on how you specify the accrual reversal rate. And we also show that in our model, just with the accrual reversal, it's not necessarily going to generate a power law distribution, because you can imagine that because the cost of committing fraud is a convex function of the fraud size. As you accumulate more and more reversal, then the balance sheet kind of idea is going to kick in. So that's going to create a constraint for the large fraud sizes, and therefore you won't see a power law distribution. Anna, sorry for the wait.
Yeah, I shared Joe's comment and concern about the smaller misreporting. And in addition to internal audit, you have other control systems in place to sort of detect some of these smaller events that would happen under the materiality threshold. And this would also allow the manager to experiment and learn, right? And that's precisely where they would do so. So I don't necessarily think that you need to, the manager needs to wait above the materiality threshold.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So how does that factor into your model, specifically the experimentation?
Yeah, so that's really a great point. So I think combining the two comments. So first of all, the monitor in our model is very general. It doesn't have to be the audit firm, right? So it can be like like you said, internal control function. And if we don't really have the materiality threshold, then what's going to happen, like you said, is going to encourage the manager to experiment. What we don't really have in the model is the extent to which you can learn about the monitor's effectiveness. You can imagine that if you commit a really small amount of frauds, it might be pretty hard to detect right? So then the extent to which you learn about the monetary effectiveness might be smaller than the case in which that, it's relatively easy to detect fraud, larger size frauds. And there, you can potentially learn faster because you commit the large frauds, then you learn very quickly. If you're not detected, then the monitor is ineffective. So the speed of learning might be different depending on the size of the fraud that you commit. So there, I think intuitively that's going to be what's happening in the model. But then the reason we introduced the materiality threshold is twofold. The first one is that we want to capture sort of this realistic idea that in real life there is often this materiality threshold, even though it can be random. But there is such a threshold being in place. And the second one is really to get at the earlier point, how to suppress the power law. So that's two purposes. Yeah. Henry? Yeah, Henry.
Okay, so building on some of the, so Chandra's point was, why don't we just, sorry, I'm going to use dumb words, why don't we just murder the little guys, right? But it seems like what you really want to do here is do nothing to the little guys and murder the big ones, so that you shut down the learning process. Like I don't learn anything from missing a big fraud, or like from not being detected doing something small. Like I shoplift a little, I don't get prosecuted. That doesn't tell me what's going to happen if I go in and steal $100 million from the Malaysian Development Bank, right? These are totally different crimes.
Yeah.
But from a social planning perspective, I really want to stop the big one. So what matters here is, in some sense, like the convexity of the cost function.
Yeah.
Not this level. So from like a policy, and I think that, maybe that criticism, definitely like letting little stuff slide seems to be a pervasive enforcement discretion issue around the US.
Yeah.
And then increasing, so like that part seems okay, but what is the societal motivation for like not increasing the convexity here as opposed to increasing the, that multiplier up front?
Increasing convexity?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so
if
like,
you go back to the cost function,
yeah, I'm
it's
sorry for
quadratic.
creating the wrong, the incorrect impression. So including convexity still play a role. It's going to delay the occurrence of the learning, and therefore it's also going to create benefits from a societal perspective. So we're not really claiming that it plays no role. It just won't prevent experimentation, so you can still experiment, but then you're less likely to experiment pretty early on because you know that the cost is going to increase very steeply down the road. So maybe let me progress a little bit, and then I'll come back to your point because we do have a figure on this. Yeah, so I believe Sugata, and then I'll move on to the next couple of slides.
Hey, Frank, this is about murdering the big guys. Going back to Henry's comment, so there is this part about, you've said this twice now about how allowing the detection rate to vary with fraud size can increase fraud size, because if the fraud goes undetected, the manager is encouraged to commit more fraud. But I'm having trouble with that because, so I've seen these cases from the perspective of real earnings management. When it grows, it permeates through the organization, and then managers end up lying about what they're doing, and it becomes a very big fraud, and then the manager gets taken to court or has to explain to the SEC. Now, it doesn't have to be that Qualcomm is committing fraud and is undetected, so is encouraged to sort of commit more fraud. If Enron or Qualcomm get caught and the SEC comes down hard on them, then there is a spillover effect to the focal firm, right? And so that's all managers are aware when the fraud has grown so big, and they're pretty nervous at that point, right?
Yeah.
So there is that deterrence effect. So I'm not quite sure how you get to the point where fraud sizes just on average would grow larger if detection probability was higher.
So
that is a result I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around.
So I think our model can actually speak to that, and also our empirical design also speak to that a little bit as well. So I think what you have in mind is the revolution of detection. So when the fraud is revealed, and especially large-size fraud is revealed, then actually revealed to peer firms that the monitor is actually effective. They were able to detect the fraud. So what we have in mind right here is not about the detection phase, it's when the fraud goes undetected, what's your incentive, compared to the case in which you're you know that the monitor is ineffective. So I think that's the distinction.
But what if other frauds are getting detected, right? You have kind of a conditional case where detection probability is high, but a specific fraud went undetected. But what if, because detection probability is high at that level of fraud, other people are getting detected, and that will serve as a deterrence?
Yeah, that would serve as deterrence. I agree with you. So far we have a one-firm model. We don't have a multi-firm model. So from that one firm's perspective, if there are other ways for the firm to learn about the monitor's effectiveness, then yes, if then also the firm learns that the monitor is more effective than previously thought, then fraud size would decrease.
Okay.
So so that's a really good point. So we should add more discussion on this. Yeah. Volker.
So quick question. In your model, the manager is updating beliefs about the ability of the monitor. So that is, the monitor could be the auditor, right?
Could be,
so
yeah.
But that would be, for that to work, the manager would need to know that next year and the year after,
Yeah.
it's always the exact same audit partner who will do the auditing.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, so I think empirically speaking, the audit firm's choice is very sticky. So for the learning story to work, there has to be some persistence. But we don't really require perfect persistence. As long as there is some persistence in terms of monitoring quality, then our story will still go through. But that's a fair point that we should discuss more in the paper. So let me move on a little bit. So in our case, even though we show that there is an increasing pattern of frauds, but it doesn't really necessarily lead to a power law distribution because large fraud need not occur frequently enough, in the case where the increase in MT is slow, where most frauds are uncovered before they become large. So to understand whether the distribution of detected frauds follow a power law distribution, we derive the survival function, which is the probability that fraud size is larger than or equal to a threshold. So one thing that to note is that the rate at which the survival function decays is a polynomial, which is akin to a power law distribution. And so now is the time to convert the model from discrete time to continuous time. And the reason for doing this is that empirically we observed sort of a continuous distribution of frauds and misstatements. So here it makes sense to convert it to continuous time so we can work with an easier survival function to derive comparative stats. So we can see that the survival function also decays according to a polynomial, which is the W here, and which asymptotically corresponds to a power law distribution. And the next one, we are going to focus on the effect of detection intensity. And there are basically two effects. The first effect is very intuitive. So basically, greater detection intensity will reduce the incentive to commit large frauds, and this is illustrated on the left panel, where the survival function shifts to the left. But there's also a learning effect we've talked about. As the detection intensity increases, you are actually going to learn faster that the monitor is ineffective, because if the monitor were effective, and if Q is really high, then the fraud would have been detected already. But given non-detection, then the manager learns faster that the monitor is ineffective. And as a result, you get a steeper slope here with a high Q. So the fraud size increases faster, conditional on non-detection for a longer period of time. So we also look at, from a firm owner's perspective or maybe from a regulator's perspective, if they have a deadweight loss from undetected frauds, so how are they going to choose Q? It turns out, the choice of Q needs to balance out this simple learning effect against the learning effect. So there will be an intermediate range of Q that minimize the loss from undetected frauds. So the next, we're going to extend the model in two aspects. The first one is that we are going to assume that the monitor does not pursue fraud below a certain materiality threshold. So this is to get at the empirical observation that oftentimes because of the resource constraints, perhaps the monitor often focuses on detecting frauds above certain thresholds. And the second one is that we are going to allow for any arbitrary form of penalty function that is increasing on convex. Okay? So with the first extension, one thing changes relative to the baseline model is that the only manipulation at above the threshold allows the manager to gain knowledge about the monitor's type. Of course, this is a theoretical simplicity. In real life, it's really about the differential effect of learning, whether you learn more or less above or below the threshold. Yeah, Joe.
The fraud's gotten over 5% of income, we're now going to hire another audit firm, they're going to come in, they're going to look at everything and redo everything, which means that once a fraud gets over a certain threshold, the size of the fraud might increase just simply because the resolution of the fraud is very different once you get over a certain size threshold of a fraud.
Mm-hmm. So in your example, is the fraud detected or not detected in this 5% cases? Because they would have an impact on.
The company, there was a company that committed fraud that got sued, and to try to resolve the fraud, they hired another independent firm that came in and said, okay, we're going to look over everything that possibly happened to this set of accounts, and then they started, and I think this was related to Savannah's point, they started detecting other things that were not in the initial detection.
I see.
Greatly expanded their work because the fraud got big enough to cause plaintiffs to sue.
Okay, I see. Basically, there is some initial detection of frauds, and then after hiring the external audit firm, then there are more bigger frauds get detected, right?
The point is that once a fraud gets over a significantly large enough threshold, you have M where, if it's below M, you're going to act differently. But I think there's another threshold where if it becomes big enough, then the remediation becomes much more significant, and the possibility of having much larger frauds once you get over that second threshold becomes much. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I don't really fully follow, because I think in that case, wouldn't you get also a larger cost of committing frauds, or is that not part of the calculus? Because it's you. Okay. Okay, after the point of detection. Okay, I see. I see. Okay. I see. I see. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All of the accounts, not just this one person that's complaining, that suddenly goes from $10 million
Yeah.
to $100 billion because it got big enough to say we've got to do more than just look at this one person that's complaining that they're not getting access to their funds.
Okay, so I think that's certainly not sort of that kind of institutional details, not really in our model. But I think it's part of sort of the probability detection that we sort of capture in a reduced form. So in the event that you commit a sort of a relatively large size frauds, and then with a greater detection probability, then you can potentially uncover even more frauds that were committed before, right? So I think in our mind that's like a greater probability of detection relative to the case in which a monitor can't really detect the additional frauds that were committed. So I think in our model can speak to that a little bit, but we don't really model the precise timing of events that you have in mind. All right. Oh, it's okay, sorry. Yeah.
Assets, or they might say something like, we're going to go after frauds that are like sufficiently damaging to people, but we're not going to give you an exact bright line. So I was wondering, would you think that contributes more to a power law forming or less if it's like a vague materiality threshold? Because I could see makes it harder to learn about the detection rate per period, but there's more to learn now as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. So in case if there is the materiality threshold is not really clear, then I think it's going to also affect the learning, because now if you manipulate, there's a positive probability you're going to learn something about the monitor. So it's not going to suppress the power law. In fact, it could actually increase the power law because of the learning. Whereas here, if from this proposition, so if you manipulate below the threshold, and because the threshold is really clear cut, then you really learn nothing about the monitor. Whereas in your case, you can still learn with positive probability. So then that could encourage more frauds. And there are really two cases here. So if the marginal cost at the materiality threshold is really small, then the manager would manipulate right away above this threshold. And if it's relatively large, then we have a corner solution where the manager would initially manipulate by very small amounts. Once he or she learns with sufficient confidence that the monitor is ineffective, then he will increase the fraud size. So that's the experimentation that we talked about earlier. And we still have a power law distribution depending on the form of the cost function. If we have a polynomial cost function, then we are going to have a power law. But if we have an exponential cost function that we talked about earlier, we will not have a power law distribution, so it does suppress power law, but we'll still have experimentation in the sense that the size of fraud would increase over time. So there is still going to be this slippery slope, but we won't have a power law distribution anymore. All right, so increasing the penalty does play a role here. And this leads to the next proposition, which is how do we think about ways to suppress the power law? And we're not really claiming this is the objective function of the regulator, but it could be part of the objective given that the large frauds are very damaging to the economy and to stakeholders. So if we set the materiality threshold at 0, then the equilibrium always features experimentation. But if we have a materiality threshold above 0 and the marginal penalty is sufficiently high, which is what we talked about earlier, then the manager is better off always reporting below the threshold and never being detected. So what this really means is that suppressing power law requires tolerating small frauds and imposing strict enforcement over material ones. And the intuition for this result is that learning the monitor's type needs to be sufficiently costly for the manager. So when we impose this large cost on learning, then the manager is better off never committing frauds above the threshold and always below, which basically prevents the manager from learning. And we want to clarify that enforcing over large frauds also serves a purpose, but its main effect is to reduce the frequency, speed, and magnitudes of large frauds, as we have seen in the previous picture on the right-hand side. Yeah, Xu.
So for your proposition 6, M lower bar can be infinitesimally small, right?
So what's that?
M lower bar can be like 10 to the power of 6 or 10 to the power of 6.
Yeah. So it can be really small, you're saying? Yeah.
Oh, so that's essentially like Chandra's point. Chandra's point is just saying you penalize, you penalize a small fraud sufficiently enough. Because in your case, you could get as close to first best as possible.
Oh, so that's, okay, so then I apologize for misinterpreting the comment. Okay, so I thought he meant like whether that would change the equilibrium manipulation amount, but yeah, so in terms of suppressing the power law, if we can have like a really small materiality threshold, like very, very low, that's close to 0, and then we impose huge penalty around that threshold, then the manager would always manipulate below. So even though I think this is a very interesting point, like theoretically, I think empirically speaking, if we go to the data, then imposing that kind of a penalty on really, really delta amount of fraud is kind of is very difficult from a regulator's perspective. All right. Yeah, so I think this is good. We have a series of extensions, and in the interest of time, I'm not going over all of them. So basically, the first extension, as we talked about extensively, we are going to allow Q to vary with the size of fraud, and we talk about how that's going to increase the incentive to commit larger frauds because learning becomes faster. We also have an extension where we basically make the monitoring type continuous. And so far in the baseline model, we have like a really star case, like either is the monitor is effective, detecting fraud with probability Q, or is completely ineffective. And you can think like in an economy where this situation may not be realistic. So we show that our results holds with continuous monitoring type. And the intuition for this result is that all we need is after a sufficient time of non-detection, then you increase the posterior belief that the monitor is relatively ineffective. And if that holds, then the learning effect will still kick in. And finally, we endogenize Q. Yes, Rodrigo.
Can I just go back to Joe's point? Like, I think you say that you can have a generic regulator here. It could be the SEC, it could be the auditor, it could be internal auditor. And what I'm having a hard time understanding, the explanation is intuitive. So you can imagine the SEC is not going to go after anything below some 5% threshold. Well, but then the auditor might not go after anything like in certain accounts, receivable account.
Yeah.
But then the internal auditor is not going to go to people stealing paper clips, right? But once you have all these layers of regulators, how do you put those things together, right? Like it's not that you have a single regulator. You're going to have like multiple one of them.
Yeah.
Does that change where you get?
So I think it's going to depend on how we think about the probability of detection. So it's more likely that the probability of detection is higher with larger amount of frauds because everyone is paying attention to each individual large fraud cases, right? So it's also possible that the probability of detection is smaller for a smaller fraud cases. It's because only the internal function is paying attention to the smaller amount of frauds. SEC does not really have incentive to go after these smaller cases because of resource constraints. So in that case, it fits, I think, to the first extension that we have in mind, where we make the probability of detection as a function of the fraud size. And I think it's indirectly capturing sort of the multiple regulator or monitors detecting frauds, but that they pay attention to sort of different types of frauds, right? Yeah. So we also have an extension. I think it's the third extension where we endogenize Q. So where basically the regulator is learning about the monitor is learning about the manager's type, which can be honest or dishonest, and then the manager is also learning about the monitor's type. Yes. Mike.
One sentence that kind of summarizes this, it's a little confusing, is in your conclusion. It says, when average monitoring quality is higher, lack of early detection is a stronger signal that monitoring quality is lower. I'm trying, that sentence is confusing to me. And
Okay.
I think does it have something to do so if I'm a manager committing fraud, I look at everybody else getting more highly detected, and I'm making inferences about my own monitor being poor. But are you assuming monitoring is idiosyncratic to a given firm, or everybody shares a monitor and we're learning about each other's monitoring? I'm trying to figure out how that.
Yeah, so that's sort of related to Stugala's earlier question. So we definitely should better discuss that. So what we have in mind is not learning about the other monitors. So what we have in mind is that in the economy, there are different types of monitors, and I'm dealing with one of them. I just don't know which type I'm dealing with. And so therefore, if I know that the effective ones detect fraud with high probability, and my fraud is not detected, that implies to me that the monitor I'm dealing with is probably the ineffective one. So that's what we have in mind. All right. So I'm happy to talk with you afterward. Yeah. All right, so on the empirical side, we use the restatement data from audit analytics. We keep restatement data likely intentional, focus on annual misstatements, and where total assets exceed $1 million. We also scale misstatement by firm size because firm size also has a power law distribution. So the first result is really evidence of a power law distribution. So we have the probability density function of power law showing on the slides, and we estimate the parameters based on standard procedures of estimating power law distribution, and we can't really reject the null that the empirical distribution differs from the power law distribution. And we have run a series of robustness checks on this, and they all consistently show that the misstatement data follows the power law. And the next one is that we want to show some evidence of a slippery slope, which is something that has been shown by prior research. And so we want to test this. Our prediction is for a given restatement event, then the size of the restatement increases over time. So as a result, we create an indicator variable for the largest annual misstatement amount for a given restatement event, and regress it on the number of years since the restatement beginning date, and also an indicator variable for the last year of the restatement event. And to give you a notion about the length of a restatement, typically it varies between 1 to 5 years, and you rarely see a restatement event that's longer than 5 years. And we also include the restatement fixed effects because here the prediction focuses on the time series evolution of the misstatement amount for a given restatement event. We also want to test whether the growth in the misstatement amounts increases over time. So we replace the dependent variable with an indicator for the largest growth in the annual misstatement amounts during a restatement event. So the result is depicted in this following panel. So we can see that the probability that the largest restatement event happened in later period increases significantly as time progresses, and also the likelihood that the largest misstatement happens in the last period also is significantly higher than other periods. So this indicates to us there is this growing misstatement pattern, at least within the restatement event. Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, sorry to take you back a couple slides, but in testing whether you have a power law, the null here is that you do have a power law, right? So it seems like it could be a hard null to reject. Like you might not have much statistical power just because it's based on very extreme events that don't happen all that often.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you can do some simulations or something just to give a sense of how much statistical power you would have to reject that null.
Okay. So we can definitely do something along those lines, but I think the procedure, the way that we compute the standard errors actually follow from the literature that estimate the power law distribution, which explicitly takes into account the the difficulty of estimating a power law distribution. And you also bring up a really, really interesting point, because this was also my intuition before I go into that literature. So I thought the identification of a power law distribution come from the tail, but in fact it's actually coming from the middle range. And exposed is intuitive because in the tail you have very sparse data. So it's the middle range that really gives you sort of the real identification. And of course, for the case of misstatement, you don't really want to include the very small amounts because those are likely unintentional. So there is going to be a trade-off. So we have run this kind of analysis, and it suggests that we can't reject the null, but we always have to be careful. We can't reject the null. It doesn't mean that null is true. And the next step, we want to show some evidence of learning, and this is extremely challenging because learning by definition is not something you would easily observe in the data. And here we are actually using the idea that Skada and Mike mentioned earlier. So basically, we are going to use the peer firm misstatement detection. And the reason for doing that is that misstatement detection for the focal firm is actually endogenous to its economic fundamentals. So that's the reason why we look at peer firms. And we build on prior evidence that all the firms are organized as geographically decentralized offices. And for that reason, our treatment group is going to be those focal firms with at least one peer sharing the same headquarter county and auditor announced the restatement during the fiscal year. So basically, we have a focal firm, its peer firm has an auditor that announces misstatement, and that should tell the focal firm something about the effectiveness of monitoring by their own audit firm. Our control group is at least one peer that also shares the same headquarter county, but does not share the same auditor announced the restatement. And the reason for this control group is to control for general effect from knowing a peer restatement, because prior literature shows that a firm can actually learn about strategy of misstatement from the peer misstatement itself. So here the control group is to account for that effect. We also control for standard variables like market-to-book ratio, leverage, natural logarithm of total assets, ROA, stock return, and return volatility. And here we show that the first column is without any kind of fixed effects, just basically the simple difference in differences estimator. So we see that the probability of misstatement decreases after revelation that the peer firm misstatement got detected. And the column 2, we really tighten up the fixed effect structure. So we include not only the control variables, we include a treatment cohort by firm fixed effects because we have a stacked difference in differences design, because there are multiple peer restatement treatment over time. We also included the industry times year fixed effects to control for time trends, and also state by year fixed effect to control for the state level economy. So everything is, so we still get a significant and a negative coefficient. Right, so how am I doing on time? Okay. So this is the evidence of learning. So the parallel trends assumption seems to hold, like leading up to the peer restatement, and then it declines significantly after the peer restatement event and seems to be persistent. And the way we interpret the result is basically is consistent with the the evidence of learning. So I think given that I have around 8 minutes, so I want to briefly talk about the first extension that we talked about, in which is the detection probability increases with size. So could you click on the extension button, please? Okay, so let me jump here. Thanks. So we assume, so here in the first extension, we are going to assume that effective monitor detects fraud with the intensity Q prime that's equal to the following function, which is basically an increasing function of the fraud size. Okay. So basically what's happening here is that more manipulation makes detection more likely, and we can think about, we have discussed various scenarios this might be true, and despite the empirical data rejects this, but I think it's intuitive from a theoretical standpoint. And there may now exist strategies in which a very high fraud amount in the current period allows the manager to learn the monitor type almost perfectly. So because the intuition, again, is that if we really jack up the fraud size, even though that may lead you to a really costly detection, and as a result, suffer from that, but the benefit is also very large, because now you can almost learn perfectly the monitor's effectiveness. And as a result, fraud size may become unbounded in the confines of our model. So we impose the technical constraints, that sort of behaves like the balance sheet constraints we talked about with Mark earlier. So that would get us around this issue so that we have an interior solution. And here really, that even though the formula looks complex, the intuition is still the same. We have the marginal benefit of misstatement. And basically, you get the benefit today, and then you have to survive until tomorrow. Okay, so you get additional benefits. And then there's a marginal cost. Now depends on not only the marginal cost of condition on being detected, but also you get this additional piece where, because the cost of committing frauds, so larger fraud will make it more likely you are detected, so you are going to account for that possibility in terms of the greater probability of detection into the calculus. And here, you're still going to update based on non-detection. And where the updating is going to be a function of the cost. And that's where the learning can speed up. Yes?
So in the model, you pay a penalty for M, which is the current year's statement. But then you talked about, and that's what I see in this equation. But when you talked about restatement, we were restating back to 5 years. So is the actual assessed penalty under M plus M minus 1, M minus 2, M minus 3? Which is not in your model, right?
So I think, so in our model, we can make the penalty to be a function of all the cumulative amount of frauds. So let me clarify. So you're thinking like, the restatement typically happened to the past 3 years. And so are you thinking that maybe there are additional misstatements in year 4 and 5 and that we're not incorporating? So is that sort of what you have in mind?
No, I'm saying you're looking at the incremental benefit, which is I'm going to do this fraud, incremental fraud today. But if I get caught, I have to pay for that fraud, but they may go back and I have to pay for fraud in the years before, years before. So I'm not only losing on this year's amount of misstatement, but the prior years.
Yeah, that's completely right. So effectively, that's how we model it. So the benefit is to get the per period manipulation. The cost is going to be based on the cumulative amount. So I thought your questions were more about like, there are some cases where you don't really restate a year like further in the past. But I think, when that happens, typically you still need to restate the balance sheet, right? So there's still, something information that's get captured. I think I'm running out of time. Right, so I just briefly go back. So just to conclude, so we demonstrated that fraud distribution obeys the power law, And the mechanism in our model is that the manager engaging in fraud to learn about monitor's effectiveness, he increases fraud size after manipulation goes undetected. And as a result, this leads to a slippery slope of financial misreporting, and that increases in steepness. We also show that increasing the detection intensity of an effective monitor can lead to more frauds, a sufficiently high materiality threshold punishment that grows with the size of fraud can suppress massive scandals. All right, so really appreciate everyone's comments and feedback. Safe travels home.
Thanks very much, Frank. Thank you, everyone, for coming. If you don't mind, maybe we could just take a second. Hopefully, she'll pop in a minute, but just to thank Lisa for her wonderful job of organizing everything as usual for 20 years in a row, I think. There she is. Thank you, Lisa. Everything worked wonderfully and very smoothly as usual. Thank you for that. And so if you want to grab a box lunch, you can do so outside. You're responsible for sort of arranging your own transportation to airports. If you want to sit in the lunch area or the breakfast area, that's fine as well. We have it until 2 o'clock. And we hope to see you again next year. Thank you for this year's conference. We're actually going to be back here again next year, partly because we couldn't get our downtown building. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this place, and we'll be back in the same location again. Good to see everyone. Have a good time coming back.